I thought grief was the worst thing that could happen to a marriage. I was wrong. 6 weeks after my stepdaughter died, my husband sat me down on our couch, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles looked bloodless, and asked me to hear him out. His voice had that careful, rehearsed softness people use when they already know they're about to hurt you. He told me his ex wanted a baby. Not with a new partner, not with an anonymous donor, with him. At first, my brain tried to protect me by misunderstanding. I heard words like IVF and legacy and Lily's DNA, and I kept waiting for the part where he said, but of course I said no. Instead, he looked at me like I was the one who needed to be reasonable. I want your input, Tim said, but his eyes wouldn't hold mine. They kept dropping to the floor like guilt had weight. My chest tightened so fast I thought I was having a medical emergency. The living room, our living room, the one we'd painted together, the one where Lily used to sprawl on the rug with her toys, tilted slightly. My hands went cold. My throat made this tiny sound, like my body was trying to swallow a scream. What about us? I managed. Tim exhaled hard through his nose like the question was unfair. Paula, Melissa is destroyed. You know that. Destroyed. As if I hadn't been waking up with my pillow damp from crying into it. As if I hadn't held my husband while he shook in the dark. As if I hadn't stood at a funeral staring at a small casket and told myself, be strong, because their grief is bigger than yours. I left the house without grabbing my coat. I drove for hours with the radio off, the road noise filling the silence where my future used to be. And somewhere between a red light and an empty intersection, a thought landed in my stomach like a stone. If he could even consider having a child with his ex while we were trying for our own, then I didn't just lose Lily. I might have already lost my husband too. My name is Paula, and I'm 35. The kind of woman who used to believe that if you worked hard, loved honestly, and stayed loyal, life would eventually meet you halfway. I'm not naive, just structured. I like plans. I like calendars and labeled folders and knowing where the ground is. I work remotely, the kind of job where my days are measured in deadlines and emails and the quiet satisfaction of finishing something cleanly. Tim used to tease me for it, pressing a kiss to my forehead and saying, if the world ends, you'll still have a spreadsheet ready. Tim is 42, warm when he wants to be, charming without trying, the kind of man who can make a cashier laugh with one sentence. When I met him, he already had a daughter, Lily, 7 years old, big eyes, sharp wit, and a laugh that always sounded like she was about to tell you a secret. He and Melissa, his ex, had split when Lily was 1. The story Tim gave me was simple. They were young, it didn't work, but they stayed civil for Lily. He called it doing the right thing. And to be fair, in the beginning, it looked like he meant that. I met Tim at a friend's small dinner party. I wasn't looking for anything serious. I'd just come out of a long relationship that taught me exactly what I didn't want, emotional chaos disguised as passion. Tim felt calm, safe. He listened more than he spoke. When he smiled at me, it wasn't predatory or performative. It was like he was genuinely pleased I existed in the same room. On our third date, he told me about Lily. No dramatic confession, no guilt tripping, just honesty. I need you to know I'm a dad first, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with a steadiness I remember clearly. If that scares you off, I get it. It didn't scare me off. It anchored me. A man who knew responsibility didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a green flag. When he introduced me to Lily, he did it carefully. He didn't throw me into her life like a replacement. He framed me as Paula, not your new mom. Lily studied me with the seriousness of a tiny judge, then asked if I liked board games. I said yes, even though I was terrible at them. She beat me on purpose the first night, and I knew it because she smirked after every move like she was daring me to notice. When Tim went to the kitchen to grab drinks, Lily leaned toward me and whispered, Dad gets sad sometimes, but he's better lately. That sentence stayed with me. Melissa and I were never friends, but we were polite, respectful. There were drop-offs where she kept things brief and businesslike, and I did the same. We didn't do shared holidays or cozy blended family brunches, but we also didn't do war. It was what I later learned people call parallel parenting. 2 separate lanes, same destination, Lily. And for years it worked. Tim and I married 4 years ago. Not a massive wedding, something warm, meaningful, manageable. Tim gave me the ring. That matters, because later, when everything cracked, I kept thinking about the moment he slid it onto my finger and promised me I was his future. We built a steady life. Lily stayed with us every other weekend and longer in the summer. She had her own room at our house, her own toothbrush, her own pajama drawer, her own little corner of the couch she claimed like territory. And somewhere along the way, I started loving her in a way that didn't need permission. 8 months ago, Tim and I started trying for a baby. Not out of pressure, out of hope. Lily was excited. She'd talk about teaching the baby to ride a bike, about training them to like her favorite cartoons, about how she'd be the best big sister because she was already basically an expert at humans. Then, 6 weeks ago, everything collapsed. It started as a cold, a fever, one of those things you assume will pass because children get sick all the time. But this time it didn't pass. It escalated so quickly it felt unreal, like watching a car crash in slow motion, while your body refuses to understand what it's seeing. A rare infection. Aggressive. The doctors tried everything. And then one morning, Tim came out of a hospital room with his face hollowed out, and I knew. Lily was gone. After that, our home didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum of before. The empty bedroom, the shoes by the door, the silence that wasn't peaceful, just wrong. And in the middle of that grief, I believed we were going to hold each other through it. I didn't know Tim was already building another life in his head, one that didn't include me. The first cracks were subtle, almost invisible if I hadn't been paying attention. Tim started disappearing into his phone more than usual. Not for work. This was personal. Texts, long calls in the garage, small smiles that made no sense. When I asked, he'd shrug and say, "Just checking on something for Lily," or, "I'm talking to a friend." I believed him. I wanted to believe him, but the unease gnawed at me. Melissa's presence in our lives, though limited to co-parenting, suddenly felt heavier. Tim had always been careful, meetings at school events, brief exchanges during pickup, but now he lingered on his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. She'd message him at odd hours. Sometimes he'd chuckle softly, just slightly too private. I chalked it up to grief bonding, but my gut told me something else was brewing. I noticed small inconsistencies. He said he'd been at work late, but his office log said otherwise. He mentioned errands I later discovered he hadn't run. Little white lies, innocuous at first, but enough to set off alarms in my mind. One Friday evening, I caught him scrolling through his email in the guest room, a strange mix of excitement and anxiety on his face. When I asked what he was doing, he quickly minimized the screen and forced a smile. "Just work stuff," he said. But the way his fingers hesitated over the keyboard, it was as if he was holding back a secret too heavy to contain. I started noticing the way he spoke about Melissa. Not casual, not passing references, he would defend her decisions vehemently, justify her requests, even when I thought they crossed boundaries. And yet, if I questioned him too directly, he'd retreat, guilt-laden, muttering, "I'm just trying to do right by everyone." Even Lily seemed to sense it. She'd ask questions like, "Mom, why is Dad smiling at his phone like he knows something I don't?" Her voice would tremble slightly, like she was trying to read between the cracks of adult behavior. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late one night, gripping a mug of cold tea, replaying months of interactions in my head. Each message, each odd grin, each unexplained absence. It painted a pattern I couldn't ignore. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it's just grief. Maybe he's trying to process Lily's death in his own way. But the pit in my stomach wouldn't stop burning. I thought back to the moments that had seemed minor but now felt like warning signs. How he flinched when I mentioned expanding our family. How his tone softened strangely whenever Melissa's name came up. How he'd suddenly go quiet as if he were measuring the consequences of words he hadn't yet said. Every interaction added weight. Every unexplained smile, every whispered text, every secretive glance. It was a slow, insidious accumulation. The house, once warm and safe, began to feel like a gallery of unease, every corner echoing with unspoken truths. By the end of that week, the air between us had thickened. Conversations became cautious, measured. Silence stretched longer, and every time Tim stepped out or his phone buzzed, my mind raced. Is this about Melissa? Is this about a new baby? What aren't you telling me? It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was the unsettling sense that my marriage, our carefully constructed life, was being reshaped behind my back. That the foundation I had trusted, the promises I had believed in, were being undermined while I mourned the daughter I loved with all my heart. I kept asking myself, was I blind all these months? Did I miss something? Could I have prevented this? And deep down, I already feared the answer. The moment I realized the truth didn't feel cinematic. There was no dramatic confrontation at a restaurant, no slammed doors, no shouting. Just a quiet, unbearable unraveling that crept into our living room one Tuesday evening. Tim had asked me to sit down after dinner. He avoided eye contact, fingers nervously twisting the edge of his coffee mug. The air felt thick with the weight of words unsaid. I braced myself. This is it, I thought. This is the conversation where everything changes. He began cautiously. Paula, there's something I haven't been completely honest about. I felt my pulse spike. What do you mean? He inhaled sharply, like the admission had been bottled inside him for years. Melissa, she wanted me to help her have a baby. I blinked, and blinked again. My brain froze, trying to process. At first, I thought he meant IVF or some sort of sperm donation conversation, something we might discuss reasonably. I thought maybe she was asking hypothetically, but his next words knocked me off balance completely. She already did it, he said, almost in a whisper. I wanted the floor to open beneath me. My stomach lurched. My hands clenched into fists, my nails biting into my palms. Wait, what? What do you mean, already did it? My voice trembled, high-pitched, unrecognizable even to me. Tim swallowed hard, finally meeting my gaze, eyes glimmering with tears. She had an embryo transfer 3 days ago. She's pregnant. The world tilted. My heart raced uncontrollably. My chest tightened as if my ribs were being crushed by invisible hands. The room spun slowly, and for a moment I couldn't even hear myself breathe. My mind tried to deny it. No, that can't be true. You're misunderstanding. It's not possible. But the truth was staring me in the face. The man I had trusted, the husband I loved, had silently agreed to a life-altering choice that directly impacted our marriage. A choice I wasn't even consulted on. Tim, my voice broke halfway through the word. I could feel tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. You didn't tell me about the embryos? Not ever? Not when we were dating? Not when we got married? Not when we were trying for a baby? He nodded slowly, guilt-heavy. I didn't want to risk losing you. I thought it was easier this way. Easier. That word burned me. Easier than telling me the truth. Easier than respecting our marriage. Easier than letting me decide. I stood abruptly, hands shaking, vision blurring. The room had become a trap, the walls closing in, every object suddenly accusatory. The couch we had sat on for countless nights talking about the future felt alien, foreign. The framed photo of Lily laughing in the park mocked me silently. I stumbled to the window, gripping the sill for balance. The city lights of our neighborhood blurred into streaks. My throat tightened as I fought to keep from screaming. How could he do this? How could he betray me like this? Tim approached slowly, hands raised, careful, tentative. Paula, please. I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt you. I shook my head violently. But you did. You already did. While I was mourning our daughter, while I was... My voice caught. I couldn't even finish. He reached for me, hesitant, like I might shatter if he touched me, but I recoiled instinctively. There was nothing left to reach for. The intimacy of our marriage, the foundation we had built together, had been corroded silently over months, hidden behind grief and secrecy. I felt rage, disbelief, sorrow, and betrayal collide into a single, overwhelming force. Every memory of shared plans, whispered hopes, and dreams of our own family turned sharp. I had loved him, trusted him, mourned with him, and in return, he had already crossed a line I never thought could exist. And then came the hardest, quietest realization. The child growing inside Melissa was now irrevocably entwined with my marriage, my grief, and my life. I wasn't just hurt, I was being displaced. That night, I left the house. I didn't grab my bag, I didn't call anyone. I drove, aimless, through empty streets, tears blurring the world outside. I replayed every conversation, every seemingly innocuous message, every small grin, and realized they had all been breadcrumbs leading to this betrayal. By the time I returned hours later, I knew one thing with crystal clarity. Nothing would ever be the same, and I would not, pretend it might be. I sat on the edge of my sister's guest bed, the fabric of the comforter bunching under my fists. The room smelled faintly of lavender and laundry detergent, a scent meant to soothe, but now serving as a cruel contrast to the storm inside me. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to breathe. All I wanted was for the world to pause so I could gather the pieces of my shattered trust. Every thought twisted into questions with no answers. How long has he known? How could he do this behind my back? Were the embryos always part of some secret plan? Did he love me at all, or just the version of me that could accept this betrayal? Tears came in waves, uninvited and unrelenting. They blurred the lines between anger and grief until the two were indistinguishable. I remembered the little things I had overlooked, the subtle signs that had now become glaringly obvious, the private messages, the soft smiles at the mention of Melissa, the unexplained absences from our conversations. It wasn't just deceit. It was a slow, quiet erasure of me from decisions that mattered most. But anger wasn't the only emotion. There was also a sickening sense of responsibility, as if I had somehow failed to prevent this. Was there something I could have done differently? Did I miss a signal? Could I have stopped this? The questions were endless, spiraling and suffocating. I realized that even in my own home, my mind had become a battlefield where reason and betrayal fought for dominance. I thought about Lily, her laughter, her tiny hands gripping mine, her whispered secrets. The void her absence left was unbearable, and now, the impending arrival of a child connected to the man I trusted, the woman I had never considered a rival, and the daughter we had all mourned together, it was a cruel echo in that emptiness. It felt like an insult layered on top of grief. I called Tim later that evening. My voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of everything I was trying to process. "I need space," I said. "I need time to think about whether I can even stay in this marriage after this level of deception." He was silent for a moment, and I could hear his own grief and panic weaving through the line. "Paula, please don't shut me out completely. I know I've hurt you, but I didn't see another way to protect our marriage." "Protect our marriage?" I repeated, the incredulity sharp as glass. "You hid life-altering information. You made decisions that affect my future and the foundation of our family without telling me. That's not protection, that's betrayal." The conversation ended without resolution. I hung up and walked around my sister's living room, fingers brushing over the couch and shelves, anchoring myself in reality. But reality felt warped, as if the air itself had shifted. Everything familiar was now tinged with suspicion. Everything safe now tinged with threat. I spent the next 24 hours in a blur of isolation. I didn't contact friends or family, beyond a brief text to my sister letting her know I was alive. I didn't eat much. I barely slept. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a spike of panic. Every quiet moment was filled with visions of the future I had imagined for Tim and me, and every one of those visions now felt stolen. And yet, amid the storm, a small, persistent flame of clarity began to glow. I realized that while Tim's deception was massive, it was not my fault. I had been betrayed, yes, but I had not caused it. And if I wanted to reclaim any sense of control, any sense of self, I had to confront it with purpose, not just with emotion. By the second day, I had drafted a plan. I would separate myself physically first, moving temporarily to my sister's house to create space. Then I would consult a lawyer to understand my rights and options. Most importantly, I would prepare myself mentally to face Tim, not as the woman who had been blindsided, but as someone who could demand clarity, accountability, and boundaries. Even as I planned, the grief for Lily never let up. Her absence was a constant ache, a reminder that life was fragile and fleeting. But now, grief was joined by determination, a determination not to be sidelined in my own life, not to have my voice silenced, and not to allow deception to dictate my future. I knew that facing Tim again would be excruciating. I knew there would be tears, arguments, perhaps even pleas I might not have the patience to hear. But for the first time since the revelation, I felt the smallest glimmer of control return. I was still standing. I still had a choice. And for the first time since Lily's death and Tim's betrayal, I allowed myself to think, maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim my life. The next few weeks were a war waged in quiet, tense increments. Each day I returned to my own apartment after staying at my sister's, the space that had once been mine now feeling alien, a reminder of trust broken and boundaries crossed. Tim tried to bridge the distance, sending texts that alternated between desperate apologies and pleas for understanding. I read them. sometimes shaking with rage, sometimes trembling with disbelief, and then deleted them. Each message was a small reminder that the line between grief and betrayal had been obliterated. I enlisted the help of a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rebecca Cole, to navigate the legalities of separation and the emerging divorce. She listened patiently as I recounted the full sequence. Lily's death, Tim's secret knowledge of the embryos, and the final, devastating revelation that Melissa was already pregnant. Rebecca didn't flinch, didn't suggest reconciliation as a default. She only asked questions that helped me organize the facts, separate emotion from reality, and assert control where I could. It was empowering, in a quiet, measured way. Meanwhile, the personal escalation began. Tim's father, Robert, got involved after Tim confided in him. I had never been close to Robert, but his protective instinct for his son quickly became a weapon in my favor. He was blunt. "Paula, what he did was beyond anything I can excuse. You have every right to draw your line." Hearing someone from his own family validate my outrage gave me the smallest, necessary boost of strength to face the coming confrontations. And confrontations came swiftly. Tim and I met to divide finances and discuss practical matters. Every time I sat across from him at the kitchen table, I felt the air tighten as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He tried to explain, to justify his choices under the guise of grief. "Paula, I was trying to honor Lily's memory. I wanted a child related to her, to keep a part of her alive." I shook my head. "Tim, this isn't about grief anymore. This is about trust. This is about decisions you made without me that will shape all our futures without my consent. How do you justify that?" His voice wavered. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you from the complexity. I didn't want to hurt you." Protecting me? By hiding an entire pregnancy from me? By making unilateral decisions that affect our marriage and our life? My words cut through the space between us like shards of glass. The house seemed colder, more cavernous. Even the sun streaming through the kitchen window felt too harsh, too bright, like it exposed every lie. Friends and family began to weigh in too, some intentionally, others out of concern. Mutual acquaintances who once praised our marriage now whispered opinions in my presence, questioning Tim's judgment, some siding with him, some quietly urging me to let it go. Each interaction reminded me that the emotional fallout extended beyond the walls of our home. Rumors, assumptions, and secondhand interpretations spread invisibly, creating pressure I hadn't anticipated. I also discovered that Melissa had told several people that I had known about the embryos all along and had given my consent. That lie, though indirect, stung. It wasn't maliciously confrontational, but it insinuated deceit on my part and threatened to isolate me from social circles I had trusted. My lawyer advised carefully, and we prepared documentation to clarify the timeline and my lack of involvement. Every interaction, every phone call, every glance between Tim and me became charged. The tension in our shared spaces, though temporary, as I stayed mostly at my sister's, was palpable. Even small things, like the sound of the faucet running or the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, made my chest tighten. My mind began analyzing every detail. Gestures, tone, word choice, timing. I was hyper-aware, constantly bracing for surprises, for manipulations, for betrayals I hadn't yet discovered. And then came the mounting evidence of Tim's prolonged secrecy. I learned that he had been in contact with Melissa far more frequently than he'd admitted. Messages, phone calls, and subtle updates about the embryos had been ongoing for months. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a carefully compartmentalized deception, executed over years under the guise of protecting me. I confronted him directly, documentation in hand. "These aren't accidents, Tim. These are deliberate choices. Every call, every message, every omission, it adds up. You lied for years." He remained quiet, fidgeting with a pen, his face pale. I could see the guilt etched into every line, but it didn't lessen the impact. The silence was a wall I couldn't break through, one built from betrayal too massive to excuse. By the third week, I began reclaiming control. I limited contact to practical matters only. I established my own boundaries. No discussions of Melissa or the pregnancy outside legal or financial necessity. no negotiations about reconciliation, and no tolerance for emotional manipulation. Every step I took to protect myself felt like climbing a mountain, each small victory providing a grounding sense of power I hadn't felt in months. Even so, the escalation was relentless. Friends, family, and even mutual colleagues tested these boundaries, unintentionally or otherwise. Each time I had to reinforce the rules, assert my autonomy, and maintain emotional composure while grief, anger, and betrayal churned inside me. Through it all, I realized that my strength didn't come from denial or anger. It came from clarity, understanding what I could control, acknowledging what I couldn't, and refusing to allow Tim's actions to dictate the shape of my recovery. The house we shared, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. But in that chaos, I began to feel something I hadn't in weeks, the faint stirrings of agency, the knowledge that I could act, that I could reclaim my life and dignity, that I could choose my own path, even if it meant leaving the person I had once loved most. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the weight of everything finally pressed down so hard I couldn't breathe. I was sitting alone in my new apartment, just the essentials, packed boxes lining the walls, my laptop open but ignored. The sky outside poured gray sheets of rain, each drop echoing the heaviness in my chest. I felt smaller than I had in years, swallowed by a world that seemed indifferent to the betrayal and grief I carried. For hours, I stared at the walls, tracing cracks in the plaster, feeling the emptiness. The silence of my apartment was absolute, save for the occasional rumble of distant traffic, but it was suffocating. I thought about Lily, her laughter, her tiny hands gripping mine, her bright, knowing eyes. I thought about the dreams we had shared, her as a big sister, me as a mother, and Tim as the man who had promised to walk beside me through it all. None of it would ever exist now. Then I thought about Tim, about Melissa, about the pregnancy I had never consented to and never imagined. My heart felt fractured in a way I couldn't even articulate. It wasn't just anger or sadness. It was a deep, gnawing isolation, a sense that the people I had trusted most had chosen to put me outside their plans. I felt like a ghost in my own life. I tried to call my sister for comfort, but I couldn't form the words. I sat on the edge of the couch, hands gripping my knees, and let the tears come. They weren't loud, dramatic sobs, just steady, unstoppable streams, each one carrying the exhaustion, betrayal, and grief I had been bottling up for weeks. I replayed the moments over and over in my head. How Tim had hidden the embryos from me, how he had quietly agreed to Melissa's request, how he had maintained the illusion of partnership while making monumental decisions without my input. My mind felt like it was spiraling, a never-ending loop of shock, anger, and disbelief. I realized in that moment that I could not trust him. Not now, not ever, perhaps never again. Every conversation, every interaction, every small gesture of reconciliation suddenly seemed layered with deception. My marriage, once my anchor, had become a source of fear and uncertainty. Sleep came fitfully, filled with fragmented dreams of being trapped in rooms I couldn't escape, doors that led nowhere, and Lily's laughter fading into silence. Each morning, I woke with a knot in my stomach, a constant reminder of how fragile life could be, and how quickly the people you love could turn your world upside down. In that darkness, I felt completely alone. Friends reached out, but their words seemed distant, abstract. They couldn't feel the layers of betrayal, grief, and exhaustion that wrapped around me. Even my family, supportive as they were, could not step into the reality of experiencing my marriage's unraveling from the inside. And yet, amid the despair, a single, stubborn thought emerged. I cannot stay here forever. I cannot let this define me. I realized that my power lay not in changing Tim or rewriting the past, but in reclaiming my life. I had to make decisions for myself, independent of the expectations, manipulations, and grief-induced confusion that had ensnared me. It was a small flicker of agency, almost imperceptible in the overwhelming darkness, but it was enough to keep me from fully surrendering. I began to write a list: practical steps, legal advice, boundaries, and ways to protect my emotional health. The exercise was painstaking, slow, but each item on the page gave me a fraction of control I hadn't felt in weeks. I knew the coming days would require confronting Tim, navigating the divorce, and untangling the shared finances and memories. It was daunting. It was painful. It felt impossible. But for the first time in that long, gray afternoon, I felt the smallest hint of resilience. The darkness was still there, but I could see the edge where it met a faint light. And I knew that if I could hold on to that, if I could take one deliberate step forward at a time, I might survive this, and perhaps, eventually, reclaim a life that was entirely my own. The turning point arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the form of clarity rather than confrontation. It wasn't a thunderclap or a sudden revelation. It was a realization that I had been waiting for. I was the one who still had a choice. Not Tim, not Melissa, me. I had spent weeks oscillating between grief, rage, and disbelief. I had replayed every conversation, scrutinized every message, questioned every past decision. And yet, the truth was undeniable. Tim had acted without my consent. Melissa had acted without my consideration. But the power I still held lay in what I would do next. That morning, I met Rebecca Cole, my lawyer, in a small coffee shop. I needed an impartial voice, someone who could help me translate chaos into strategy. As we spoke, reviewing documentation, timelines, and the full extent of the deception, I felt an unfamiliar calmness wash over me. The pieces of my life, though fractured, were still mine to arrange. "Paula," Rebecca said gently but firmly, "you have a few paths here. You can fight for your rights, you can protect your assets, and you can set boundaries. You can do all of that without needing to justify your emotions to anyone." Her words resonated deeply. For the first time, I saw my agency clearly. I realized that I didn't need to negotiate forgiveness. I didn't need to argue morality. I only needed to assert my boundaries and safeguard my life. Later that day, I received a call from Agent Brunson, the FBI investigator who had been assisting me in the Clayton case months earlier. He didn't offer solutions or apologies. He simply reminded me of my strength in facing manipulation and deceit in the past, and the importance of documenting and asserting facts. It was an unexpected boost. I had survived a high-stakes, coercive situation once before, and I could survive this. With my resolve growing, I called Tim. The conversation was brief, precise, and unemotional. "Tim, I've made a decision. I will not accept this situation. I am filing for divorce. You will not have my consent regarding these embryos. All further communication will go through our lawyers." There was a long pause on the line. I could hear the ragged inhale of someone finally realizing that control had shifted. "Paula, please," he began, but I had already hung up. No negotiation, no justification. My boundaries were firm, immovable. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at Lily's framed photo on the wall. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. The grief was still there, the ache of betrayal still raw, but for the first time I could envision a path forward that wasn't dictated by Tim or Melissa. I began organizing practical matters: the apartment, finances, legal paperwork, and emotional support. I reached out to my therapist and scheduled grief counseling for myself and eventually for Tim, if he chose to engage. I called close friends who had offered unwavering support, and together we created a network that felt safe and grounding. By the end of the week, I realized something profound. The power Tim and Melissa had wielded through secrecy and deception only existed because I allowed it. Now, armed with truth, clarity, and the support system I had rebuilt, that power no longer held sway over me. I could define my life. I could reclaim my identity. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about asserting my worth and reclaiming my agency in a situation deliberately designed to strip me of it. And that, I realized, was the most important step toward healing. For the first time in weeks, I felt a steady heartbeat beneath the chaos. A quiet strength that whispered, "You are not powerless. You are not invisible. You will survive this, and you will define what comes next." That night, I wrote a letter, not to Tim, not to Melissa, but to myself. I listed everything I had endured, everything I had survived, and every right I had to protect my life and my future. As I wrote, the edges of my despair softened, replaced by a firm, grounded determination. I would grieve Lily. I would mourn my marriage. I would face the consequences of betrayal and deceit, but I would not be defined by them. I was stepping into the next chapter as a woman fully aware of her worth, fully committed to her boundaries, and fully capable of reclaiming the life that was always hers to shape. The days that followed were a careful, deliberate unraveling of the life Tim and I had once shared. Divorce papers were signed and served. Our joint accounts were divided, assets accounted for, and all remaining decisions mediated through lawyers. Tim didn't resist. Perhaps guilt weighed heavier than pride, or perhaps he realized that the trust he had shattered could never be repaired. Either way, his acquiescence was a bitter confirmation of the reality I had been forced to accept. Our marriage was over. Friends and acquaintances who had quietly watched the drama unfold began to react. Some offered support, some offered judgment, and some simply disappeared, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the deception he had carried out. I welcomed the allies quietly, appreciated the distance from those whose loyalty had always been conditional. Tim's relationship with Melissa, now concretely linked to the child she was carrying, shifted in the eyes of our social circle. People began to see the consequences of secrecy and long-term deception. Mutual friends who had previously sympathized with Tim's grief now acknowledged the betrayal he had orchestrated. The narrative that had painted me as overly sensitive or hard to understand began to crumble under the weight of facts, evidence, and legal documentation. Within Tim's own family, dynamics shifted rapidly. His father, Robert, had initially tried to mediate, but as the legal and emotional fallout progressed, even he began to distance himself from Tim's actions. Calls and invitations became sparse. Tim's credibility, his standing among his peers, and his influence within his own family had eroded in ways that no apology could repair. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding. My apartment became a sanctuary, a space designed entirely around my needs, free from reminders of betrayal. I unpacked slowly, organizing my books, photographs, and personal items with care. Each object placed with intention reminded me that this life was mine, shaped by my choices, not dictated by the deception of others. Work became a lifeline. I reconnected with old colleagues, pursued opportunities that had been sidelined during my marriage, and started networking in ways that felt empowering rather than obligatory. Each professional success, each acknowledgement of competence and dedication reinforced the narrative I wanted for myself. A woman defined by her abilities, integrity, and resilience, not by the betrayals inflicted upon her. Even the lingering presence of Melissa's pregnancy could not destabilize me. I chose compassion without compromise. When news reached me that she had entered her second trimester, I acknowledged the fact, internalized it, and let it exist without anger or interference. It was a reality I could not change, but I could control how it affected me. My boundaries were clear. She and the child were outside my life, my concern only limited to protecting my own emotional well-being and reclaiming what had been stolen from me. Through this period, I noticed a subtle shift within Tim. Deprived of the ability to manipulate, to surprise, or to override my consent, he seemed diminished, not physically, but in the sense that the power he had wielded through secrecy and deception had evaporated. He could no longer shape narratives or control emotions. His attempts at reconciliation or explanation were now filtered through lawyers, measured and impotent. The man who had once held sway over my trust now had none. Socially, the ripple effect was clear. Friends who had quietly defended his actions began to distance themselves. Others, who had doubted my judgment or questioned my responses, now acknowledged that I had been right to enforce boundaries and protect myself. The fallout was comprehensive. Tim's standing, relationships, and reputation had taken a measurable hit, while I moved forward with clarity and authority over my own life. Perhaps the most profound change was internal. The grief, betrayal, and anger that had once consumed me no longer dictated my day-to-day existence. I could reflect on Lily's absence without being paralyzed by it. I could acknowledge Tim's actions without losing myself in rage. I could envision a future shaped by my decisions, guided by my values, and insulated from the manipulations of others. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt a sense of closure, not the artificial, temporary closure people speak of, but the genuine, grounded kind that arises when one asserts boundaries, enforces accountability, and reclaims personal agency. I was not seeking revenge. I did not need to humiliate or punish. The consequences had unfolded naturally. Truth, integrity, and self-respect had their own quiet power, and they had rebalanced the scales. In that calm, deliberate space, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I was no longer trapped in a narrative written by betrayal. I was authoring my own story, one step at a time, reclaiming both the life I had lost and the woman I had always been beneath the weight of grief and deception. 6 months have passed since the divorce was finalized. I've moved into a new city, taken a new job, and carefully reconstructed my world around what I need and who I want to be. My apartment is small, cozy, and entirely mine. No reminders of betrayal, no shadows of what once was. Each morning, I wake up with a sense of agency I hadn't felt in years. The grief for Lily is still there, but it's quieter now, reshaped into memories rather than constant pain. I've begun volunteering at a local youth center on weekends, working with children who remind me in small ways of Lily, her laughter, her curiosity, her energy. It's a grounding experience, a reminder that life can still hold joy, connection, and purpose even after devastating loss. For the first time since everything happened, I feel capable of hope, of envisioning a future not dictated by others' choices or deception. Tim has fully embraced his role in Melissa's pregnancy. They communicate, attend appointments, and prepare for the child, though they insist their relationship is strictly parental, not romantic. I do not concern myself with the details. What mattered most was reclaiming my life and establishing boundaries that safeguarded my emotional well-being. The lessons I carry from this chapter are profound. Trust, once broken, is not always repairable. Grief can cloud judgment, but it does not excuse long-term deception. And the most crucial truth I discovered, the only power we truly have is over ourselves, our choices, our boundaries, and the paths we decide to take. I've learned to be compassionate without compromising my integrity, to acknowledge pain without letting it define me, and to rebuild life deliberately, one small, meaningful step at a time. Sometimes, the most shattered moments become the foundation for the strongest selves. If there's one message I would offer to anyone navigating betrayal, grief, or impossible circumstances, it is this: protect yourself, assert your boundaries, and never let someone else's decisions rewrite the story of your life. Healing is not linear, but it is possible, and reclaiming your voice is the first step toward freedom. I don't know what the future holds. I may love again someday. I may pursue new paths, new dreams, new adventures, but for now, I am present in my own life, anchored in the strength that comes from surviving betrayal, standing firm, and choosing myself. The past cannot be changed. The pain cannot be erased. But the life I build from this point forward, that is mine, entirely, unapologetically mine.